Today's topic is a bunch of handy tips and techniques for doing florals. And I want to start off kind of where we left off last time for those of you who were with us last time when we were talking about using mixing grays, because one of the problems that a lot of people have with florals is their shadows on the florals kind of just look like dirty spots on the florals. So if you take what we learned last time about mixing grays, that can really be helpful. So I want to start off by having a look at some actual photographs and some paintings. Let's look at some shadows. I'm going to start with this flower. And if you look right in this area, you'll see there's a little bit of shadowing, and then there's more as we move down. And the usual thing, if you're not thinking about it deeply, or you're just kind of worrying about all the things you have to worry about with watercolor, mixing your color, the distractions of how wet is the paper, how wet is the brush, where am I going to put things, how am I handling my brush. Sometimes we just sort of mentally assume, well, this is all gray. All this stuff here is gray. But it isn't really gray. So let's kind of zoom in. When we zoom in, you see that it's really kind of a grayed down yellow. It's still pretty yellow. So let's look at another area. Right over here, again, it's sort of got a yellow-green color underneath it. So it's not like take some Payne's gray and make these shadows. That just doesn't work very well. So what works better is to mix your shadow colors for your flowers using the color of the flower and some of the surrounding colors in your painting, and then maybe a complement. So this flower is sort of a pale yellow. So let's come over to the demo table. So if I were going to paint something like this yellow flower, and I'm not going to try to paint the whole thing, but because right now we're just talking about color, but I know that I've got sort of a pale yellow going, and the complement of yellow is violet. So let's take a little violet. Now this violet is a little bit too red, so I'm getting more of a brownish tone, but that's actually good because some of these areas are kind of a warm yellow anyway. So this is going to be, I'm going to kind of test and do a study over here. So that's actually, once you put it on the page, not a bad color for the shadows down here. So if we were going to paint this flower, let's just focus on maybe this area right here because we've got quite a bit of variation. So we've got this pale, almost white, and it's going to be hard to see that until we painted some of the background there, but we've got that petal, and then we have a petal that comes in front that's got sort of a warm dark on it. And then it becomes yellower here as we go down, and paler as we go down toward the stamens. And then over here, we actually have quite a bit darker. Now you might think, okay, well, I'll just put gray in there, but what I'm actually seeing in there is green. Let's check that. This area right here, it's kind of greenish. So instead of putting in gray, I'm going to use a grayed green for that area. Let me just extend this down. So I don't usually, I usually mix my greens. So let's get a little blue out here. And then I'll gray it down by adding it to that warm tone. And it's not dark enough, so let's get a little bit more. And for some of you who haven't watched me paint before, if you're freaking out that I'm putting my dirty brush right in that color, if somebody will remind me during the question and answer, I'll show you how to very easily clean that up if you need to. Not this minute, but remind me later. So then I would drop in those shadow areas with this dark green. And then as I get down here, I think I'll use a combination of both of them because it's sort of in between that warmer tone and the cooler tone. So so that's just a couple of petals. And of course I've ignored the stamens completely, but I think you can see that that gives you a way to get some of the color. Now, I know right now it's pretty hard to tell much about anything because this has a dark background around it and this doesn't, and so you just have it compared to the white. And in fact, let's tip it a little bit. So it's pretty pale still. So to be able to actually see what's going on there and get that sense of light, we've got to get this dark background in here. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to talk about sort of the next tip, which is, you see how this flower is surrounded by out of focus areas. And very often you'll find, I'm going to find a different example just a moment here. So this is an even better example. So here's the little lonely flower in the middle with sort of dark all around it, and that's how people will paint it. And somehow then you have to do this wash that goes around in a circle and figure out how to connect it up. And that's a problem. And I actually don't have too many like that because I try not to have that happen. So what I've done here is I've cropped in so that when I lay this background wash, I can do this little section in one piece, and I can do this section in a piece, and this section in a piece. And then even when I get to this area, you might think, well, that's all one big section, but there's sort of a stem or something in here that I can use to break it up. So I have places where I can stop and reconnect without getting a hard edge. So without taking the time to paint the whole detail of the rest, let me just get a little bit of the shape of this flower so we can talk about painting that background. And I know this is hard to see because it's so pale just yet. So just bear with me. We will get to it when we've got some background to work with. You could actually kind of flood the whole page with the pale yellow and just paint the background over it. And that might even be an easier way to go about it. So obviously I'm not taking a lot of time with my drawing here. But let's imagine that I have sort of painted my flower and now I'm ready to lay in the background. And so I need a dark, sort of a dark green back there. So let's mix ourselves a dark green. I don't think I'm going to go quite as dark. And hopefully while I'm mixing, this is drying somewhat so we won't have a lot of runs. So now I can do this section in one piece. And then I can pick up down here and do this section. And what I'm going to do is where I have this stem, I'm going to actually paint that first, and hopefully that will be wet as I get down to it, and so it'll bleed in to my dark as I paint my dark in there and sort of naturally blend it. So obviously you could be picking up different colors here and making this a little bit more varied too if you weren't doing a quick little demo, if you were taking some time and drawing it out first. So now when I connect up with that, it gives me a place to pause in my wash so I don't have to be in such a big hurry. But it also, since it's still wet, it just blends in and gives me that out of focus look. And then on this side, let's pick up here and then work our way up so that again, I'm working into that stem and it's bleeding and being out of focus. So I'm obviously I'm negative painting this flower shape, not very well either. So at this point, I have just sort of the outer silhouette. And you can start to see, now that the background's in, you can see some of these shadows laying in here. And now we can start building the shadow areas down here. So those shadows also are somewhat greenish, so I think I can use some of the green that I already have. And these are actually pretty soft shadows here. This harder edge is something that we will want to paint as we're painting these petals going down. So maybe let's start doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet this part, and then where it's a little darker there, I'll drop in some darker color, and I'll let the watercolor do the job for me of kind of blending that out. So that gets one petal right there. Let's do the same thing with this one. Kind of wet that background area. And then wherever we've got these little bit darker shadows, we'll drop in some color and let the watercolor kind of blend it out for us. So by doing this, we're sort of building depth. We've got those being pushed into the background by the fact that they're behind this harder edge. So things that are hard edge tend to appear to us to be more in the foreground. So let's continue that over on this side. So I think you can, at this point, maybe get the idea how, because I'm using a gray-green instead of something like Payne's gray, and because I'm varying it, it looks more like it belongs to this flower and this scene. So what you see in the flower shadows are the color of the flower itself, and then also a lot of reflected light. And since most of what's around it is green, that's what we're going to see as reflected light. So I'm going to pause on doing any more of this because we don't have time to cover every single thing I would do if I were doing this flower, because I know somebody's probably sitting there thinking, yeah, but what about all this mess in the middle? So before I tackled this mess in the middle, I would actually finish doing my shadowing in this part too. But if I do that, then we'll have to wait for it to dry, and there's not time for that to happen. So instead, I'm going to pretend that that's all in there, and talk about how would I handle these little stamens here and all this confusion of various stems going every which way. So one thing I'm not going to do is try to paint every single doggone one. Now you can, but that's not my style. I prefer to suggest rather than show every single thing. So I'm going to think about ways that I could suggest these little stamens. So one way I could do that, let me just grab a little scrap. Okay, so one way to handle this might be to say, can I make little brush marks like this that basically work like those stamens? And I think for me that works well. And so then I can overlap them, and I'm going to do the stamens first. So again, we're pretending we've already done the shadowing in there, and now we're going to do the stamens and concentrate on that pattern of overlapping stamens with just little brush marks, not painting every single one. And I'm kind of looking at how they are arranged more than each individual one. Brush is getting a little dry, so we'll get some more. Some of these really clump together. So as I'm doing these and I'm overlapping these brush strokes, if you want more definition, what you would do is come back in later and separate some of them, but I don't think for something like this that that's really all that necessary. So now that you have the stamens in, you can kind of, or the, I don't know, what's it called? The part that's just the end of the stamen. Now you can make the little stalks, and they're pale green. But what you want to do here is paint mostly the darker areas and let the light areas shine through. I think I need to add a little bit of this, even though I said let's pretend the shadowing is in there. It looks a little weird when it doesn't go into anything, so let's make it go into something. So instead of going in here and masking everything, if you paint the pattern and then go in and say, okay, like right in here, there's a darker area, let's add that. You can create a little bit of a sense of depth, start to create a sense of depth without painting every single individual one. So let's add just a little bit more shadowing. So I don't know if you believe me yet that this works. So let me add a little bit of the shadow on these petals over here. This is a hard edge right here, so I'd have to let it dry, but in the interest of trying to kind of get some of the shape. So you see how the shape of that petal starts to be built around the stamens? And over here, I can just paint right over that because those actually are in shadow. And then if you want some modeling on the stamens themselves, you can come back in and add it to them individually, to a few of them. I personally would not spend a lot of time doing that, but you can. So I think that's as much as I'm going to say about shadows for right now. I want to talk a bit about composition. And for that, I want to go back to the iPad. So when we talk about composition, on this view right here, you can see a bunch of different compositions. So this was the photograph where I was saying, you know, you kind of got the lonely little flower in the center. And I want you to compare how that works compared with some of these others where instead of putting, like this one, for example, it's a single flower. We'll look at that closer. It's a single flower, but instead of sort of putting it in the center and having just out of focus all the way around it, what we've got is it's sort of asymmetrical and the center of interest is down in here. And I've broken up that background so that I don't have to lay the background wash all in one piece. I've got a section over here, I've got a section over here, section over here, and here where it looks like it goes around that corner, I actually broke it right here with the same idea that I used with that stem on the little quick example I was doing. And I want to also go in and look at these shadows and see how much color variation is in there. So one thing that helps keep your shadows from looking weird on a flower is that they actually have the kind of variation that goes on in the flower. This area right here, there's some light that's coming actually through the petals on the inside and bouncing down into this area, and then it doesn't quite reach out to this area. This is quite green down here, and this is more violet. You get the red reflecting from the interior. So that color variation actually plays a big role in making the shadows believable. So looking at the same thing up in this area, you see we go from a very warm shadow right here out to a cooler shadow as you get to the background. And this flower in the actual garden that it was in was not against a purple background. I put that in because I wanted that for the room that the painting was going to hang in. And so I picked up that color here instead of the greens so that it looks like whatever this is, I don't know, some plant with red leaves, whatever that is the thing that's reflecting there. So if you do that kind of changing in the background colors, then you'd want to change the foreground colors or the shadow colors as well. Another good example is this one. So in this one, you see how I added this blue background. This was just in a regular forest with a lot of leaves, green leaves, but I wanted the blue in the painting for my own reasons. So the shadows here are quite blue where the light would be reflected, and then they're sort of a warm pink tone where the light is shining through the back of the flower, and the flower itself is a sort of a pale pink. So you don't have to use green all the time. You can use something else if you're putting your flower in another setting. Another thing that I wanted to point out about or suggest to you about composition is, let's look at this one right here. This is a photograph of a bunch of pansies. And one thing that works well sometimes when you're composing a painting of flowers is to think of each flower as kind of a little face or a little person. So you can almost see this as like maybe a collection of people at the bus stop, you know, and here's mom talking to the little kid, and here's somebody looking off in the distance to see if the bus is coming, and this person's checking their phone. And that can give you ideas for ways to help the viewer's eye move around the painting, because just as we will follow the gaze of a person in a painting, you kind of follow the gaze of the flowers. They sort of have almost a face, and pansies are great for this because they almost do have a face. So if I were going to design this painting, I might do a little work to rearrange some things to emphasize that and use that to move things around. Maybe I would add, maybe I'd take a little of the clutter out back here and move this one up and add some other pansy, maybe this one, looking back this way to bring the eye back in. So when you have multiple flowers, instead of saying, well, I'm just going to paint exactly what I see in the photograph, you can think about, well, if I rearrange them a little bit, just like you to rearrange them in a floral arrangement, can I direct the eye around the painting and maybe tell a story? And, you know, you could actually probably have some fun with these pansies, you know, making them into little scenes of people at parties and people at the bus stop and people in, you know, waiting for their phones or looking at their phones while they're waiting in the doctor's office, you know, things like that. So when you do your compositions, think about ways to move the eye around, and with flowers, think about the flower being like a face, directing the viewer's eye where the flower is gazing. So So we talked a little bit about shadows and how to not have them just look like some dirt on the flower. And we've talked a little bit about composition. And now I want to talk about just a raft of little tips and tricks, because I know that when people are painting things like florals, a lot of the time it's nice to just have some ideas for how to handle common situations, dealing with things like foliage, dealing with things like those frilly edges that you saw on some of the flowers. So in the last half of this demo, what I'd like to do is show you some of my little tips and tricks for stuff like that. The first tip is right here. If you're drawing out a flower composition, I'm sure that most of you have discovered that if you want to like draw where the shadows are, then you're going to wind up with a gray line around the shadows. And since the petals are often pale colors, that doesn't work so well. So here's the secret. Use a watercolor pencil in a color very close to the color of your shadow, and then no one will see, once you've filled in your shadow color, no one will see that line that you drew to plan. So let me go back. Hopefully our little demo from before will be dry enough that we can try that. All right, we have our partially painted flower and our reference photo. And let's say that I decide I need some help planning some of these shadows in the lower area. Here's a sort of a pale yellow green, and if I use the pale yellow green to indicate where some of these shadows begin and end, like for example this one right here where there's a shadow where a petal is underneath. So I don't even know if that might be too pale for video. Yeah, you can probably barely see it right here. Let me make it darker. But of course, that's what I want if I'm actually painting this. I don't really want you to see it. So then what happens is when I come in with a very similar color to paint that shadow, instead of having a gray line, I will have, that's really also too dark because I darkened it so you could see it, so now it's dark. So what happens is the watercolor pencil dissolves right into that green area, and so instead of seeing a gray pencil line around it, it just disappears. You can use this also, and maybe I should have, given my very poor drawing here, to draw out the whole outline of the flower, and it will just blend right into the background. So if you're one of those people that doesn't like to see your pencil lines when you're doing florals, watercolor pencils are your friend. Use pale colors because you're the only one who needs to see it, and you only need to see it until you paint whatever it is that fills in that area. So even though it's pale, you can usually see it well enough, and then no one else will ever see it, and it just blends right in. When we did our out of focus background, what if you don't have something like this stem here? So I'm actually going to do it on this tip. Let's suppose we do have the lonely little flower in the middle, and I'm going to use a dark watercolor pencil so you can see this time. So somebody has done the composition of the lonely little flower in the middle, or maybe you have a reason for this, you know, that maybe you haven't done the lonely little flower, but you have an area that you need to connect, and you don't have anything that's going to break that up for you. Okay, so we've got to go all the way around this with our wash, and I'm not going to go all the way around, but let's see how I might be able to break this up. So instead of just saying, well, I guess I've just got to go all the way around and somehow connect it, what I'm going to do is wet this area up here, start painting my background and let it just bleed right in. I'll keep going on around until I get to a place where I feel like I need to stop again, and I will again just wet that area, blend it out to clear water. Now, even if I go away and don't even finish this and I come back the next day, what I can do is pick up from here. Because this is just a pale bleed, I can come back even after this is dry, and this, I know there is an edge there, mostly because I'm keeping my dirty water so you can see what I'm doing. But if that were clear water, that would dry and it would just be white again. So when I'm ready to pick up again, I'm going to wet that area, and then I'm going to start laying in my background. And I'll go as far as I can, or as far as is comfortable, because I might not be painting around such a very simple little flower like this. It might be more complicated. And when I get to a place where I feel like I can't keep going, I'm going to again just wet that area and blend it out. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, now we got these white spots here. And actually, that's a good thing, because we can make these light areas part of our design. I think I'll actually maybe be able to make this point a little better if I go ahead and finish this, go all the way around. So assuming this is a light colored flower, what those light areas do is they allowed us to break up the wash, but they also connect the flower to the edges and help improve the composition. So I didn't design these very well, I just kind of threw them in. But if you think about where might there be some light falling through this, then you can do a little bit of a cheat like, you see how there's a sense of light falling through this painting? Like the light is streaking in from behind, and everything about the composition kind of suggests the way the light is falling. So if I wanted to, I could create that same suggestion by planning where I put my light spots. So I kind of killed two birds with one stone. I create some light spots that allow me to break up my background wash so that I can manage it from a technical standpoint. And if I position them carefully, I can use them to, as part of the composition, to create a sense of light shining through maybe some leaves in the background, or streaking along like it did in this painting, and help move the viewer's eye that way. Now, if you don't like that, if you feel like, no, I don't want that, then you can let all of this dry and wet this area again. And it's actually still wet, so I don't have to wet it again. But let it all dry, wet it again, and wet it way out past where you're going to drop in color, and then drop some color in to break this up. Now, no one's going to know that that wasn't done all at once, because what you do is you bring your water out far enough that anything that bleeds doesn't make it all the way to the edge, so you don't see hard edges. It's soft edge shape overlapping another soft edge shape. So you can build out of focus backgrounds layer by layer like this too. I like leaving some of the white, but you don't have to. You can come back in, wet. So the key to this technique is, if this is actually wet, but if this were all dry over here and I wanted to fill this in, I wouldn't just wet this area. I'm going to wet way back out to here with clear water. All right, so let's see. Frilly edges. So I have two kinds of frilly edges to show you. One is this kind of edge right here, like you get on a very frilly iris or an orchid like this. And the way that I create that edge is to use my magic little spray bottle, which, oh no, I can't reach it. All right, so here's a lesson I'm learning about doing this in the van. Once I'm here, I'm trapped. And if I forget to bring anything over here, I can't get out. So, okay, I'll have to show you that one in another video. Oh, I'm so sorry. Uh, I'll tell you what I did and you can try it, but I'll have to show you this one another time. So what I did was right along this edge, I had already painted the flower and I just left it white. All of this background was still white. When I did this background, I used a spray bottle to spray all of this after the flower was dry, and then I painted the blue into it, and when you get up close to the area where the spray is, the blue crawls in around the spray and you get this kind of broken edge. I am so sorry I can't show you that. It's one of my favorite techniques, and I can't reach my spray bottle without taking all the video equipment down with me. Oh well. So I have to show you the second method for frilly edges, and that one I can show you. I have everything I need for that one. So that one is really simple. What you do is you take your brush. I'm just going to use, even though it's a weird color for a flower, I'm going to use the paint that's already here. You take your brush, and instead of painting these petals like I did, holding my brush in a normal way, I'm going to hold the brush like this, so it's almost on its side. And I'm going to roll it in a circle like this. So this is great for something like hollyhocks or, oops. All right. So this works well too for being kind of the center of something that's like maybe a morning glory shape, and then do the same little idea again to make the edges of petals, and you kind of overlap the two. Hopefully you can kind of get the idea of how I'm building this flower a little at a time. So this sort of gives a sense of petals that sort of overlap there. So I'm not painting every bit of the flower. I'm painting a suggestion of pieces of it, but you still, because it has enough of the characteristics of what an actual flower has, you still see more or less a flower. If I want to have this have a more defined outer shape, then what I can do is negative paint, like I did this one, a more definite outer shape. Or if I want this to have kind of a whiter edge, I could, let me just blend this out. So I'm just going to do one petal here, but I could do basically the same technique coming up to it from the outside. So let me use a little different color on the outside. So as I'm painting my wash out here, when I get up to the petal, I could also kind of roll the brush So I hope you can see how it kind of builds the shape of that petal with still having this kind of rough, raggedy, frilly edge. It's just about time to go to question and answer, so I'm going to show you one more technique and then we'll go to question and answer. So for this technique, I need a piece of, this is ordinary copy paper. And what I'm going to do is tear the paper. You can do this either for a leaf shape or a petal shape, but I'm going to use a leaf. I'm going to tear the paper into a rough sort of a leaf shape. And then I'm going to crumple it up so it's kind of all crumply. And you can, by the way, you can use other things. You could use plastic, you could use freezer paper, you could use wax paper for this, and you'll get a slightly different look for each one. But I really like the way it comes out when you do it with just plain old copy paper. So now I'm putting my color on the copy paper, and then I'm going to find where I'd like to have my leaf, maybe right here, and I'm just going to stamp with that. Whoops. Need to get it a little wetter. This is rough paper, so when you do it on rough paper, it's got to be pretty wet. So I'm going to lay it down, smush it, and then a lot of times if you also, let's take a slightly different color and paint around the leaf. Well, we've got some wild colors going on this painting now. Not sure that's, you know, the best color for the painting, but hopefully it's a color you can see. And then I'm going to pick up. So now what you get is it's just a broken stamp. It's not the whole leaf, which is nice because now there's still some light in the leaf. And I don't usually leave it that way. What I do is I come back later. I have this one right here. It's not the one I really wanted to show you, where you can see how you've got that underlying stamp and then color that I've laid back over it to fill it in, kind of blend it in. I had another one that I thought was a better example, but I can't find it. So I'm going to quit with that, and we'll go to question and answer.
This concludes the demonstration portion of the second Sunday Live demo for May 2019. For privacy reasons, the question and answer portion is not recorded. A handout with demonstration notes is available on my website at dragonflyspiritstudio.com. Follow the links for Learn and then Second Sunday Live demos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.